opportunity, and I'm kind of glad we're going when we're going, to listen to what happened through the day here, because I think it's going to lead right into this discussion very well. Let's face it, the reality of everything we've talked about centers around the people that are in this room that are responsible for balancing commerce, we heard about that this morning, compliance, we all love that job, right? Mark Dupont, you love that compliance job, right? Love it. And then consequence. And we've touched a little bit on a little bit of the consequence part, and we've talked a little bit about resilience. So now we're going to talk about funding that. I don't think there's anybody in this room that issue isn't at the top of your mind, especially as we sit here in a government shutdown. It emphasizes the need to look forward and not be dependent on the way we've done things the way we've done things. It really forces us to get creative, as often a crisis will. Oh, I don't know, something like a pandemic. Oh, something in Florida like a hurricane. We get good at it when we do it over and over again, as Mark Glass said, right? So how do we protect critical infrastructure? How do we adapt to the emerging threats that we are hearing about? And how do we make the numbers work? In my few decades of work in the maritime environment, in my work with the Coast Guard and my work with the state, in my current job, I've trained a lot of people. I've trained over 30,000 port security professionals in some way, shape, or form. There's always been one constant: change. Right behind that is the thing people hate the most: change. And I'm really going to ask you to really try to think outside the box, not only as this panel talks about some issues from different perspectives, and I'll address that in a second, but I want you to sit there and think for a moment and ask yourself, if I had $1 extra to put towards my port security efforts, where would I spend it? Now you're going to say, well, Mark, that's not realistic. $1 won't do me anything, won't even get me a cup of coffee. All right, let's say you have $100,000. Oh, let's say you have $100 million. You're governing the Port Security Grant Program. You got $100 million. What would you focus on to make a dramatic change? And as we go forward here, I want you to think about the perspectives that you're going to hear from. You're going to hear from academia. How can that help you? I really want you to listen to what Austin has to say. I want you to look at, from Jen's perspective, looking at it from the clients that she does business with and the challenges that they have, and I know she's going to talk about some creative ideas that have just emerged just in conversations that have transpired. And then Max talk a little bit about, oh, this is something we haven't talked about, Max, cybersecurity. We haven't talked about that yet. But on the insurance side too, what's the benefit of all that? Where does the dollars and cents start to line up? So, before I get going, what I'd like to do is the panel just to give a quick snapshot of who they are and where they're coming from, and then I'm going to ask them, we're going to go back through again, and I'm going to ask them a specific question about their world of work and whether it be a challenge or an obstacle or something that they're seeing, and then we'll get into some questions that are coming in from the field already. So I'll start at that end, Austin, since you're at the far end, and you probably sat there so you thought you'd go last. I'm just trying to mix it up. But let's go with Austin first. Go ahead, sir.
Okay. My name is Austin Becker. I am the chair of the Department of Marine Affairs at the University of Rhode Island. We're the oldest marine affairs program in the world. And for those of you who aren't familiar with marine affairs, this is a department that is very interdisciplinary and explores the human dimensions of problems impacting our coast and oceans. So we've got anthropologists and lawyers and sociologists and oceanographers and others all working on finding solutions to the world's biggest coastal and ocean challenges. So I'll stop there.
Sure,
Yes, and
that's
pass
good.
it along.
Jen?
Hi, I'm Jen Ungru. I'm with Jones Walker, and I'm out of our Tallahassee office and do governmental affairs. Jones Walker, though, has a large portfolio of maritime work throughout the country. We're based in New Orleans. Our DC office and our Florida office work with some of our friends that are here at Port Canaveral. And I tend to work on complex regulatory issues and then also appropriations and breaking down some of those silos from the federal government and to the state government and try to get those funding sources to our clients.
Max?
Thank you, Mark. My name is Max Bobys. I am Vice President of Cyber for a company called Shoreline Hudson, formerly HudsonAnalytix. I also have another role in our parent company in building out a global risk advisory group with Acrisure, which is ostensibly an insurance company. But we're on the risk management side, and our DNA is in the maritime domain, both on shipping and in port and terminal operations. And what we mainly focus on in this environment is working with leadership teams to understand their cyber risk exposure and to come up with strategies, plans, procedures, and basically approaches to how to understand, manage, and sustain their cyber risk management aspects along the same lines as compliance. And so we've worked with small companies, small terminal operators, large ports, large port authorities, and some global terminal operators that could be up there in the Fortune 500 as well. So looking forward to today's conversation.
Great, thank you. All right, now I'm going to go back around, and I'll go back to Austin here. Wait a minute. University of Rhode Island. It's not a very big place, little smaller than Florida. But your role, how do you help ports? And we talked a little bit in preparation of this and some of the things that you did with the Port of Providence, which I have a fond memory of. But what does academia have to do with all this? Why should I be out there listening to Dr. Austin?
Let me tell you.
Okay.
We've heard a lot about cyber and drones, so maybe we'll talk about something a little bit cheerier, natural hazards. So my work focuses on coastal resilience, and in particular, I work with ports and maritime infrastructure to help understand what the impacts of hazards like hurricanes and nor'easters up in New England, what those impacts mean for ports, for maritime infrastructure, and for the broad community of stakeholders that are dependent on the functioning of ports, from neighbors to shipping companies and tenants and others. So, ports, as I think this room well knows, facilitate around 90% of the world's commerce. They are also in very vulnerable locations, as you folks here in Florida know very well. About a third of the world's ports are in a tropical storm zone, the tropical storm belt. So they're subject to the impacts of hurricanes in other parts of the world. It's other types of storm events. And these can have a really big impact on port operations and the local economy and all the way up to the global economy. So the work in my lab, which is a group of graduate students, PhD students, master's students, research associates, postdocs, we explore this problem of storm impacts to ports from a variety of perspectives that are mostly grounded in the social sciences. So we do a lot of work with port administrators. We conduct interviews and surveys to help understand what this landscape looks like for folks who are actually out there making decisions, either on a short-term basis or in a long-term planning context. So we've conducted a number of vulnerability assessments for Port of Providence and also Navy Station Newport in Rhode Island, and done both national and global scale studies of how storms, sea level rise are impacting ports and what the concerns of these port administrators are. So I think there's kind of two big buckets of work that we do in this broader area. The first is focused on long-term planning. So what does the natural environment look like in 25, 50, or 100 years? And how do we align our planning efforts, especially for infrastructure, which has a very long working lifespan? So there can be a design life for a piece of infrastructure of 50 or 75 years, but as the folks here, I'm sure you all know, that many times that infrastructure far outlasts that design life. So that means that there are decisions being made about infrastructure design today and types of infrastructure that we might want to build that will have implications, 50 years, 75, or even more years out into the future. So understanding what that landscape may look like, what sea level rise may look like, the range of projections, and how they might impact our coastal areas is a really important piece of that long-term planning exercise. The other bucket is emergency management and response. So, many ports in the world are facing these big storm events, some of them on an annual basis. Some ports haven't seen these big events, but as tropical storm patterns shift, they may start to see more of them in the future. And so emergency management and response becomes a very important part of decision making around these storm events. So in my group at URI, we've been working on an interdisciplinary project with oceanographers and ocean engineers and GIS specialists to create a decision support system that combines very high resolution storm models for flooding and wind and wave with the information about those specific things on the ground, the electrical transformers, the backup generators, the HVAC units, the cranes. We collect information about those pieces of infrastructure, assess a threshold for impact, and then bring that information together with those high-resolution forecasts and provide a dashboard system that allows emergency managers to see how much flooding they can expect, how much wind, but then also what are the things that matter to the people on the ground? Why does it, if there's flooding and nothing's in harm's way, then who cares that there was flooding? It comes in, it goes, and life goes on. It's the things that are getting wet and impacted that those emergency managers and the facility managers need to know about in advance. So this is the work that, this is a role that academia can play in the risk and resilience space to lay this foundation to help decision makers better understand the context of what they're up against as they make either those short-term or long-term decisions.
Thank you, Austin. Jen, your world of work.
My world's a little bit different.
Yeah, a little different.
The seaports and security, neither of them are very unique in the fact that most of your funding on governmental sources are very siloed. They don't work with one another. You're very stuck in a box of what you can apply for and how those used for those dollars. And you start thinking in just those worlds, right? You can't think about what the next things are because the grants don't cover the next things. It only allows you for a very small bucket. That's not unique in this world. It happens pretty much in any federal or state funding. I will say the state of Florida has gotten a little bit better in trying to work across areas and break down some of those silos from our version of Division of Emergency Management to maybe DOT, Transportation, or Environmental Protection, especially because we've had so many storms over the past few years that how are we trying to build up our infrastructure? But that's going to take a little bit longer at the federal level, right? So whether it's trying to figure out how to leverage those dollars because there's caps on what you can get that grant for, or whatever your matching funds are, and that's going to be so much harder for some of our smaller ports than some of our bigger ports. And so it's taking a look at some of the different programs that we have, or even some of the reports that have come out in the federal government saying we need to look at how our scoring works, or our grant award processes. They're not consistent. They don't require the same things, and we're not allowing folks to leverage those monies from one area to another. And so really trying to take time, and maybe during a shutdown is a great time to do that, of when we come back online, are there ways in a new administration that we can look at to say, if we work with DOT and with FEMA, can we actually take care of a larger problem? Because today's dollars, we're buying boats, we're buying trucks, but we're not necessarily planning for tomorrow's problems that we've been talking about all day. And so those are some of the things that I look forward to talking more about with all of you, but that's kind of my lens of how do I help our clients or other folks kind of go through and come up with unique programs, whether they're tax incentives or maybe more grant programs, or giving you all flexibilities to use other private dollars instead of public dollars, looking for new ways, because there are limits to those grant dollars and there might be limits to how long some of those programs last. So let's start working on preparing for those next buckets of money.
Thank you, Jen. Max?
Thanks, Mark. Quick question. How many people here have been hacked personally? How about professionally? How many people don't know? All right, a few brave souls. Reality is we've all been hacked, and we've all been hacked a lot of different ways. And many of those ways we don't even know, because we don't get visibility into the credit card companies, into the Targets of the world. I mean, as somebody mentioned, the Target breach a number of years ago, and it happened right around Thanksgiving. And my wife asked me, well, should we go? And I said, absolutely. There's not going to be anybody there, and everything's going to be on sale. And so we went and did some of our Christmas shopping, and everything was on sale, and there was nobody there. So that was an opportunity. But the real question is, we've talked a lot about cybersecurity, and this is a little bit of a long-winded explanation of what I do, but I hope it'll make sense to you when I'm done.
Wait a minute, you long-winded?
I know, right?
Shocking.
It's my problem. It's my own problem. But when we talk about cyber risk management and we look at, how do we deal with this cybersecurity challenge with AI now? Everything seems like it's the ocean coming up, and how do you protect against the ocean? Well, I want to go back in time just a little bit. And for those of you who've seen me present, you've heard me use this analogy a number of times. There's an old German war philosopher, Karl Maria von Clausewitz, and he came up with the notion of war is a continuation of politics by other means. And that holds true. And he also made the observation, but the strong defense can be overcome by asymmetrical threats. And so when you fast forward and you look at today's cyberized environment, cyber risk is war in a continuation of, war by economics, social media, finance, and the military domain. It is full spectrum all the time, everywhere, all at once. And that includes U.S. Cyber Command, it includes combatant commands, it includes national, nation-state adversaries, and it also includes my daughter, who is personally on a mission to improve Jeff Bezos' cash flow. So how do you manage risk in this environment? And when you start to distill it into an organization like a port, you get into, well, who owns cyber risk? Who are the people actually in charge of managing, cyber risk? Is it the boards? Is it the C-suite? Is it the management team? Or is it the analysts and the security staff on the front lines every day? It's pretty much everybody, because when you look at this cyber domain, this threat landscape, where we've got everybody in it, including my daughter, on the same level as the FSB, well, you have to manage that risk. It never goes away. You can't leave it at the office. You actually swim in it every day. It's like the air we breathe. And so what happens is when you have that unclarity that's persistent in management teams where who owns risk, and there's not a clear answer on that, it creates disconnects between those who are trying to acquire solutions and those who are responsible for dispensing the funds to procure them. And those two types of individuals speak different languages. And that language, that common denominator, is money. But it's not often referenced as such. I always hear actually a lot, well, when the IT manager goes in front of his CFO, he says or she says, well, I always get what I ask for. Well, that says to me one thing. there isn't an informed conversation that's going on in the management suite. And so when you don't have that common denominator of money in the equation, it creates pathologies that tend to linger, and then they take root over time. And those are the dysfunctions of an environment and of management teams that then get institutionalized in the business. And so as we enter we continue to evolve in this cyberized landscape, where it's just getting worse, especially with the accelerant of AI now introduced into the equation, well, those pathologies are becoming more and more important to break through and to force change. And so what do? I work with management teams to drive change, what we used to call in the old days business process reengineering, but to work through those changes culturally and to develop the processes, the procedures, the strategies and tactics that those teams can implement in order to institutionalize methods of managing cyber risk in their environment. So.
All right, because you were long-winded, I'm going to go ask a question, but I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to go back down the line here. So given what each of you has just described, what's the recommendation? Because the question is funding of the future. What do I do right now that may impact funding of the future? Is there something specific? You can talk a little bit about insurance and that impact. And what can I do right now, right here, right now, that might impact the future? And then at the end, I'm going to ask, let's back up a little bit, look at it from a bigger perspective, a global scale.
Sure. So I think in the last session, Ollie mentioned consequences, and he talked a little bit about that. And I whispered to one of my neighbors at the table, he's stealing some of my thunder. Mm-hmm. But the truth is, when we look at managing risk in terms of cyber risk, it's about how do you apply appropriate spend in your environment in a sustainable fashion. And so oftentimes that disconnect that I just alluded to gets pathologized in misspending in ways that none of the parties really fully understand. And so when we distill it back to the conversation around consequences, when we talk about, okay, we mitigate risk, we avoid it, and then we transfer it. If we're going to transfer some of that risk, well, how much insurance do we buy? And I'm here to sell you insurance, I promise. The question arises, well, what kind of insurance do we need to buy? And so the first step in actually answering that question, so you can appropriately apply spend to your risk environment and to ensure that your consequences are being managed and mitigated financially, is to come up with what I call loss scenarios, your top 3 loss scenarios. What are the 3 things that are most important to your environment that if you lose that ability to have access to them or to those capabilities, what would it cost? Now, the IT manager will raise his or her hand and they'll have an answer. But how does that impact workforce? How does that impact procurement? If you get a bricking event, like the NotPetya attack, where it just wiped your computers clean, well, then you got to go out and buy equipment. You got to buy services to install that equipment, to redo the network, to reconfigure software and implement software, and all the integration points therein. How does that impact physical security as part of your facility security plan? How does that come into play in terms of your operational effectiveness? Are your clients going to be impacted in terms of your ability to support service delivery? Are you exposed legally because of maybe non-compliance with privacy laws or other regulations therein? So coming up with those top 3 loss scenarios involving the management team writ large, not just make it here, fill out this little questionnaire for the IT manager, but to have a conversation and to solicit inputs from all the team members that you can then derive a value of what that loss scenario looks like. Then you can start to decide, does this insurance policy, does this coverage area work for us? Are we getting the right levels of financial cover? Is our situation financially such that, you know what, maybe we can absorb some of the hit up front, and maybe what we can do is take a retention of maybe X dollars, and that's your deductible, right? So these are conversations you have to have with the team and not in a stovepipe fashion. And that's why Collaboration, communication, all the things we've talked about here, you've heard other speakers mention, is so key to understanding how to make that spend appropriate and sustainable.
And go further.
And go forward.
Jen, what's the one thing we want to,
So there's a couple of things.
no, one thing. No, I'm
Just
kidding.
one thing?
I'm kidding. Go ahead.
I think a lot of times, at least for governmental agencies, we wait for that opportunity to come. You know, that grant application comes out, you're on the rocket ship to go get it submitted, so you then are in the queue to get that money. One thing that I think we have seen across the board, and you've heard it from Mark Glass, you've heard it from the Lieutenant Governor, is they're willing to take a look at things. So talking to folks now about, we really need to do this project that's going to help our infrastructure, that's a DOT issue, that we need to widen this road. But then, is there something else, bringing your whole team in that discussion, if you're gonna go for that, and that's that bucket of money, is there anything else that's tied to that that we haven't quite thought about there? Are there new lines that you could bring in that would strengthen your internet capacities or things like that? Are there other buckets that don't fit in that grant that usually comes down this bucket but may come up in somewhere else? Or talking to them about it. Sometimes it is then asking for that appropriation for that matching fund, or figuring out if there's a local way to bring about those dollars. But I think we do have folks today that are interested in hearing on how they can help you move forward in that world. But we have to start thinking about it without looking at the grant application today and figuring out what we're going to do. But then we have to look beyond just the grants, because that's, we do think about those, and, it's not just the ports that are there. Our lessees, our customers, they're all part of the infrastructure. When you look at what the Coast Guard rule is regarding cybersecurity, it's everybody involved in the system, right? And so figuring out how you leverage your partners so that entire system is a little bit stronger, and how you're going to work together is incredibly important. And those are different ways to think, because we're always looking at what's our immediate need now. When we look at security, you're thinking about your high red blinking risks and what that problem is today. But we do have the opportunity today and tomorrow to really think about, well, if you had that magic bucket, what does it look like? And how are we going to start filling that in and combining those two things? Because it is a finite resource. Money always is, which I don't have to tell anybody in this room that, we all know it. But figuring out ways that we can leverage those different relationships and things that you don't normally put together is a lot of times how we can move that needle in a little bit further. I think the conversation Sarah talked about earlier about what Houston's doing is a great option, and I'm sure he can fill you in a little bit more on what that looks like. But here in Florida, we're not really big on provider taxes. That's going to be something that would be hard to go through, but we do have things that are matching grant programs for our state colleges that allow private donations, and the state does match those dollars. Those are other things that we can look at. Can we model a program for security that looks something like that, and get our customers and other folks involved in putting up some of those dollars that they'll get a benefit for if we have a more secure place for them to be, or things that they need to make their security a little bit stronger, whether it be infrastructure or for cyber or whatnot, that they're using our facilities, what they need to do to use them, we can help improve. Tax credits are another thing. Florida, we are big on tax incentives and having tax programs. We have things about contaminated waste, that maybe there's something like that we can leverage or use as a model to follow. And again, is it for the ports? Is it for our lessees? There are different entities that we can use and kind of work together, because that, whether it's on the physical side or on the cyber side, a small little open door could really bring down the entire infrastructure for a particular place. And so really kind of thinking about us holistically, I think will help move the ball a little bit further down the road.
So there's some words I'm going to come back to, but we've heard the echo of partnerships. We've heard thinking outside the box. Looking at partnerships. I'm going to come back to that because I think these are key words we need to pick up on. Austin?
I'm gonna take two things as well, so get ready.
That's all right. We have 3 hours. We can go.
Both of these are. I've got two things to focus on, and both of them I think are relatively low upfront cost and high long-term payoff. The first is in the area of workforce development, which we haven't talked about a whole lot today. But in Rhode Island, like in many states, we are really struggling to fill maritime-related jobs. The workers just aren't there, and I think that the ports community has an opportunity to make small investments in their communities to support programs that get kids excited about maritime careers early on. We're not talking about a lot of money, but there's a lot of programs in Rhode Island, in Florida, in every state that are getting kids out on the water, that are showing them that there are high-paying careers available to them in the maritime sector. And kids in coastal states can go through their whole educational experience and never even realize that they live, that they live on the water. This is the case in Providence anyway. So I have a background as a tall ship captain. That was my previous career before coming back into the academic world. I still wear a hat in that world with a local nonprofit that operates a tall ship that is focused on maritime workforce development. I haven't seen ports communities step up to support those kinds of programs in my 30 years of working in the kind of straddling the tall ships world, and I think it's something that ports could do, and that helps get those kids into that maritime pipeline early on, and you get that long-term payoff of finding people to find those jobs, whether it's working directly in a port or it's fabrication or it's maritime technologies. There's all kinds of pathways for those kids if you can get them excited early on. So that's my first kind of funding priority potential solution towards one of the risks that the ports and maritime world faces. And the other one is, in my current hat as the chair of an academic department that has 100 undergrads and 50 grad students doing lots and lots of research projects that are related to things maritime. This is where the ideas are born and explored. This is where we learn kind of as a society how to frame our problems. What are our risk and resilience problems? Well, a lot of them start with research. And that research needs to be supported even if it doesn't have a direct, concrete payoff in the form of a new and better crane or a new and better building. So the work that we do in my lab on coastal resilience, we're helping the communities understand what is their risk profile, what does it look like, what are the things that they should be prioritizing when they go to make that ask to the federal government for a port improvement grant or whatever the grant program, Tiger grant, whatever it happens to be at the time. And again, this is a fairly low investment in the scheme of things, but that kind of work needs to continue on. It has been, much of it historically funded through the federal government. Much of my work has been funded by Department of Homeland Security over the last 10, 12 years. Some of that funding has now been terminated, but it was work that was helping, in this case, the Port of Providence and the U.S. Coast Guard to understand their risk profile so that they could better understand where their investments should be made in a way that maximizes their return, both for long-term planning, but also in the emergency response world. But whether it's my world of coastal resilience and natural hazards, or cyber, or anything else in the maritime world, that academic component as a foundation, as laying the foundation for understanding problems and making decisions it's really a critical piece of the risk and resilience landscape.
So I can't echo strong enough to what you mentioned about workforce development. That's my sphere of influence, if you will, working at the National Maritime Law Enforcement Academy. And it echoes what Mark Luther and I have talked about for a million years. Mark will be a facilitator in the next panel. But workforce development, in my opinion, is one of those critical investments that has exponential return. And I believe in it so much that we're going to release a book shortly that's about transforming training, going from good to great. And the transformation has to take place in how we look at it. Just the discussion that you're having, Austin, about making younger generations aware of what the opportunities are. We just can't keep doing the way we've been doing it and expecting a different result. Isn't that the definition of insanity? Didn't I hear that somewhere? But unfortunately, everywhere I go, that's what I'm walking into. We're doing it this way. Why are you doing it this way? Because that's the way we've always done it. Well, that's not working. We need to think of another way around this. The other thing, to come back to Jen, you're talking about partnerships, and so I want to ask the group a question. It's rhetorical in one sense, but I just want you to think about it. What if? What if we change some of the things in the way we do business? Workforce development is one of them. But as Jen was touching upon, it isn't all about port security grants. It could be other things. There could be other buckets of money, to use the term that's been used a couple of times here. And I want to echo what the Lieutenant Governor said. I wrote it down. He said, we need to accelerate. We need to put our, this is my words, we need to put our foot on the gas pedal and look at things differently. So I just think you all in this room have an opportunity to look at things a little bit differently and to go to the administration at the state level and say, listen, this is what we've identified, and we're going to talk more about that when we get into the work group sessions tomorrow. But we've got some recommendations, and one of them may be that type of funding that Jen was alluding to. One other thing that I'm a big advocate of, and Port Tampa was one of the inaugural ports to go through this, but I believe that there should be a national standard as it relates to port security. And I think when you have a nonprofit group or assembled representatives from throughout the country to establish what those standards are, and an organization that goes out and says to a port, hey, we want to evaluate, we want to assess your ability to meet these standards. And then when you meet those standards, what's the impact? What's the impact to my insurance this year? Do I get a discount, or do my insurance dollars that I'm investing go further? Does my accreditation to this standard, does that do something as it relates to port security grants? If they're still there, do I get kind of a step ahead because I've focused my attention on the things beyond the obvious? When I say beyond the obvious, it's not about getting another camera. It's not about getting another barrier. It's not. I've looked at this in totality. The accreditation program that I'm talking about looks at, has the port digitized itself? How does it optimize that opportunity? What's its cybersecurity maturity level? And we include academia. We actually have a section where we look at what are you doing to develop the future workforce? Not the one you've got. What's the future workforce look like? Or are you building leaders from the people within that can play critical roles in your port as it grows? And then the last part of that accreditation process is looking at, okay, what's happened lately? What's the crisis that you've encountered, and how did you handle that? Or if you didn't, like that never happens, right? Nothing happens during the course of a year. But let's say you didn't have anything significant happen. What did you practice? What did you experiment with? Because that predicts what those future risks may be. Reaching out to academia is essential, and everybody in here has it available to you. We got our hosts sitting right here with open arms saying, hey, how can we rethink this? How can we look at this? And as you go on a national level, there's academia that has a tremendous wealth of experience and talent available to help us with that process. With that said, I'm going to ask a question and read a couple of questions that we've got in. But I'll preface this by saying I think that port security is all about 4 Ps. It's about people, it's about process, it's about platform, and it's about performance. The people is obvious, but there's a reason it's up there in front. Again, obviously this is my soapbox, and I step on it and shout loudly. We gotta look at how we're managing and treating and training our people. If I don't do that well, all the other things don't matter. But the next thing is process. What is our process? How do we look at risk, as Austin is talking about? How do we rethink the funding sources that we pursue? How do we look at our maturity as a whole, or are we not? So what's our process? Platforms are the tools. You know, yeah, often is what are the boats are they driving? What tools do they have in their toolbox? But obviously, it's different for every type of employee I have, every function I have in my organization, which leads to how do we perform? And how are you measuring that? You're telling me you do good. Against what? What's that standard that you're measuring against? So we may think that we're doing good, but oftentimes we get the best opinion when, I'll speak for myself. My best opinion is when I ask my wife what she thinks. Because I will have thought it through and think I've got this all figured out, but even though she doesn't work in my space, it's amazing how she'll look at something I'm working on and go, hey, did you think about this? And I go, no, I didn't. So, with that said, I'm going to read this first question, but I think we've answered it, but I'm going to throw it out to the panel anyway. When justifying funding, how can ports quantify the avoided cost of downtime from cyber, drone, or storm events so resilience spending is viewed as economic protection, not overhead? I think it's a great question, and I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's the difference that we have to make, but let me throw that to the group. Anybody want to take that one?
I'll throw myself on there. This goes back to something I was talking about earlier about loss scenarios, but it's on the it's actually the reverse, right? Well, and I think it touches on some of the things other panelists were talking about earlier in terms of, you know, what is the cost associated with the capability to defend against a threat, right? What's appropriate? Is it appropriate to send a $100,000 missile against a $5,000 drone? You know, probably not. So how do you justify, you know, what works? And so I would take the opposite approach in looking at loss scenario analysis as, okay, what are your crown jewels? And what is it going to take to defend those crown jewels against those top threats? So if you can quantify your loss scenarios against your crown jewels, then you know what money, you know, what is the financial risk exposure. And then take the opposite approach. Okay, if we're going to make investments in people, processes, tools, and money to protect those crown jewels, okay, can we allocate $10,000 to protect $1 million asset? That, to me, makes a lot of business sense. But if we're starting to encroach on something like a $50,000 mitigation against a $50,000 asset, well, maybe, I mean, again, I'm not here to sell insurance, but maybe insurance plays a role in that. Or maybe you need to rethink about what is appropriate to putting together maybe a solution that gets you halfway there, and then you transfer that cost, that difference, right, to a financial instrument like insurance. So it's sort of like the opposite, right, of how to inform insurance, but to how to allocate appropriate solutions to mitigate threats against your crown jewels. So there's a longer conversation there, of course, but I think at a top level, that's what I'm trying to accomplish. So,
Anyone else? Jen?
I look at it as the growth side. So nobody wants to stay at the same level of whatever your revenue is, right? Everybody's trying to grow. You're only moving, if you're moving your family from one house to another, you're looking at how safe that neighborhood is, how good the schools are, everything else. And you're in a competitive market for the customers coming in. So as you're building your growth strategy, if security is not a huge component of that and how you're going to get your customers, your trajectory is going to be shorter. And so that return on investment of those new dollars that you're trying to bring in has got to have that security component to it, or it's not going to happen.
Anything to add,
Yeah, just, so this is a really tough question to answer, how do you quantify damages avoided? And I think it's even more complicated because, you know, we tend to think of damages avoided as the damages to, say, the port. But when you have an event at a port, it has these ripple impacts through the whole community. And, you know, the port it's a public good. It's serving a public function. And when it is down, and especially as a result of, say, a natural disaster where you often have environmental impacts as well, there are a whole lot of impacts that are very difficult to quantify in dollar terms, but are really important to the communities around that port and the supply chains and you know, the businesses and the environment. So this is a good question, and I think the answer needs to incorporate those externalities as well as those direct damages to the port itself. And I'm not an economist, but I do work with economists, and these are the kinds of questions that we try to tackle in the academic world. They're research questions, they're challenging and complex, but going back to what I was saying before, it's those dollars to fund that kind of research that get us to the answers that we need in order to make good choices.
I just want to add something to what Austin just talked about in terms of the ripple effects. And I think it's important because one of the areas where we see huge impacts to an organization's cyber risk profile is third-party risk. And one of the ways into an asset is actually through third-party risk. That third party can be my daughter, or it can be a trusted partner. And so the question arises, well, how do you understand the potential risk exposures with your dependencies with cloud service providers or other partners, right? Well, you need to look at your service level agreements. And what do you have to do for that? You need to bring your contracting in, maybe even in-house counsel or external counsel, and look at those terms of your SLAs. I'll give you a quick analogy on why that's important. We transfer is a service, and it's free, and you can, you know, their value proposition is to enable you to send large files to a third party, to whoever you want to send it to. Well, for those of you who are not aware, WeTransfer over the summer changed its privacy terms. And what did they do? They embedded in the privacy, you know, check here to accept our terms and conditions. Nobody reads it. You check here, and what happened? They were using data of their clients to train their AI model. And what that did was that basically represented a risk to your data that maybe an employee was using to transfer a file to perhaps someone else, and all of a sudden you've got a huge risk exposure, including potential liability with fines, you know, breach of contract in terms of confidentiality. And so it was a big deal. So, and then of course there was an uproar and they changed it back. My point is that it's turtles all the way down. Your cyber risk is, it's all around you. You take it home, you have it with your partners, and that's why when we look at supply chain security, it's about managing the risks in your supply chain, and there are ways to do that in terms of putting plans, policies, procedures, tooling to help you accomplish that mission.
Thank you all.